Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Jeri Bowers is a longtime friend of the Maine Science Festival, and I'll always be grateful to her for taking a cold call from someone she had never heard of with a crazy idea to have a celebration of Maine science. You'll hear in our conversation that we are aligned pretty closely with what we think of Maine science, its value, importance, and worldwide reach. Although Jeri doesn't work as a scientist, her role in helping non-scientists of every kind understand what is happening at MDI Biological Laboratory is just as important in many ways. Having someone who can be a translator of sorts is always going to help when the language that is used can be very specific. One note, very occasionally you'll hear a ding in the background. That's the result of talking via Zoom and forgetting to turn off notifications. I think it's safe to say we've all experienced that in the last 16 months, so it won't be that unusual of a sound for you. Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast.
Thank you.
I know you have been working for science organizations for essentially your entire professional career.
I have.
But I admit I have no idea what your background is. So isn't that great? I mean, we've known each other for a long time now. We always talk science, but I don't know how you got there. I don't know if you have a science background or not. So
neither do I, actually.
Perfect. Then we're both in the same boat because I'm not sure how I ended up doing what I'm doing.
Oh my gosh. So yeah, I totally fell into this career completely by accident. It was not something I ever envisioned myself doing, to be honest. I'm a 7th generation native of Mount Desert Island. So I grew up here and always knew about the Jackson Laboratory. I mean, I passed it every single day. I grew up in a little teeny village of Otter Creek, which is about 3 miles from the Jackson Laboratory, and had never stepped foot on the campus. It was like,
wow.
You mice, ew, it stinks. No, I don't want to go there. So yeah, my background was more in kind of medical assisting, that kind of thing. My father was a registered nurse, and that was something I really had always wanted to get into, and somehow got sidetracked along the way and was doing a lot of, medical transcription, working on that side of things. And I was, sort of went to school and came back, was living in the Bangor area, and decided I wanted to move back down to the island, and happened to put my application in for, there was a temporary agency. And because I could type like a demon, 90 words a minute and whatever. So I got an interview at the Jackson Laboratory, and I was like, oh, wow. Okay. Well, so I went in there and I did my typing test. I was all of, 21, and they made
we might have to explain what typing is for our younger listeners. And why it's such a big deal.
They made me repeat it twice because they thought I had cheated.
Oh, God.
So anyway, yeah.
Oh, that's great.
So I started working there in public relations and loved it. There was so much about the lab, Jackson Lab, that I had no idea, even being, growing up and being as close to it as I was. I just didn't understand the international reach of the work that they were doing, the science certainly, but also just in, being such an important resource for science around the world with the mice that they produce. So that was a real eye opener for me, I think, to have come from Maine, come from a place we don't always think of ourselves. And I say that as, as the state, as having kind of international reach or impact or doing work that's, on that level. And so it really sort of opened my eyes to what's possible, and the fact that we need to do a better job of telling our story and telling it even to our own residents, to help people understand that Maine is not necessarily so remote. We are playing a big role in the scientific arena, and it's something we should be proud of and we should tout, So that's kind of been my mission.
This helps me understand all the more why you were willing to talk to me when I called you out of the blue and was like, so I have this weird idea about a festival. Like, it totally aligns with what you've been talking about and all of that. So what, did you take any science classes in college that were beyond the requirements?
I was a horrible science student. Horrible. I hated it. It was not, that's what I was terrible at it. It was the one class, everybody has that class in high school where you just sort of have a traumatic experience. And I happened to have a teacher who was one of those guys that would just call you out and sort of embarrass you in front of everyone. And so it scarred me for life. I was like, no. And I immediately went, and I had, like I said, I'd wanted to sort of be on a maybe a pre-med track was kind of what I was thinking about. And I just immediately switched to all business courses. I was like, nope, this isn't for me. And so the irony of it is just, hysterical to me that's where I ended up. But
well, it's also a little bit of a loss, I would say. How did you figure out the science that was happening at Jax? Was it just talking to people? Was it kind of your own, like, I wonder what this is?
Yeah.
Because it's not, we're you and I are both old enough. It's not like there were things accessible then that there are now, right? You can't go online. You couldn't go online and figure it out. You couldn't do like a story collider. Like you had to really sort it out.
Right. Well, and I was, that was really my job, was to figure it out. I was working there in the public relations office. So it was, it was entry level, but I was learning. I was really kind of had a front row seat to understanding, what the science was. And as a non-scientist, I felt like I was in a unique position to sort of be able to say, help me understand this, help me understand why this is relevant, what matters. And so, and I had a great mentor, a guy named Jeff Witherly, who really, he was a lot of fun, and he had a great sense of how to make this work relatable. And so he taught me a lot about how to do that. And when I was at the Jackson Lab, I had been in public relations for probably 3 or 4 years, and I kind of got recruited over onto the fundraising side of things. And that, again, was not something I didn't even know you could have a career in fundraising at that point. I mean, I just sort of became, by accident, just sort of got into that field. But because it mattered to me, I think, I could see why it was important, and that made it easier to really talk about why supporting science is so important.
So why did it matter to you so much?
That's a really good question. Personally, I lost my dad to lung cancer when I was 18. And that was one of those just really powerful, I guess is the best word for it, but it was a life-changing experience. And because he was a nurse, I was really interested in medicine. I was very sort of hands-on with that whole process. He was diagnosed when I was 10 years old, and they gave him 6 weeks to live. And I remember him saying to the doctor, you see, I was there in the room with him when he was given that diagnosis. And he said to the doctor, I will watch her graduate from high school. And he died 6 months after that. And so it was just part of who I was, growing up that way. And so the idea of working for an organization that had such an international reputation in cancer research really resonated with me at that point.
Do you think you had an advantage by being a non-scientist in your role, in that people didn't assume that you knew anything? And I don't mean they talked down to you, but they had to explain it to you in a way that made sense, which would then make your job easier.
Yes. And I mean, I felt like I had it was okay for me to sort of ask the stupid questions, right? I could just come to it from that perspective. And I just, felt as though if I could understand it and explain it to other non-scientists, then that was a good, if I felt like I had a good handle on it, then I felt really confident that I could explain it to other people. And of course, there's a lot of, you don't want to get it wrong. You don't want to oversell. You don't want to oversimplify. But at the same time, it's keeping that objective in mind, which is just to help people appreciate why it matters. And I think a lot of people have my sort of same experience where a loved one has suffered from a disease of some sort. And so they come to it from that place. And certainly if you've gone through that, you understand, why that kind of research is so important.
Were you the only one in the office doing public relations who didn't have a science background?
Yes. Well,
Wow.
That's not true. I mean, Jeff did not have a science background, but he certainly had worked in healthcare, and he had that he had a PhD in communications. But I mean, he did not have a science training per se. So
you really were the oddball out in a good way. Like they were forced to talk to you in a way that they hadn't had to, which
right.
is really. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy actually for scientists who have spent so much time mastering their field and routinely talk to other people in those fields so that they can talk in this shorthand and this jargon and just keep going. Like I totally get it. I totally understand why it's easier, but it has become a self-limiting barrier to explaining their work.
Yeah, I mean, I feel optimistic about it because I think this generation really understands, whether it's social media or whatever the reason, they just sort of come to it naturally, which, 30 years ago, that was not the case. And I think in some ways, competition for funding has really, forced people to be able to explain why they do what they do and why it's important, why it should be funded. Yeah, I mean, but I totally hear you. I think it is unfortunate. They're doing such important work, and I think a lot of them are just like, let me do my work.
Yeah. So how did you end up at MDI Biolab?
Oh, wow. So I had been at the Jackson Lab for about 10 years. I was in fundraising there and running their annual fundraising, I don't know, just under $1 million a year, I guess. And a colleague of mine who had come to the Jackson Lab had moved over to this little seasonal research lab that we used to call MDibble at the time. I mean, I didn't really know that much about it, but he called me one day and he was like, Jeri, I have decided to accept a position elsewhere. He's moving out of state. And he was like, I have fallen in love with this place and I want you to come and see it. And I think you'd be great in this position. And I was like, yeah, no, I'm not interested. And he was kind of relentless and said, oh, just come, you don't have to just come see what it's like. So I went to the biolab. It was again, I think the first time I'd ever been on their campus.
They're super easy to miss. Yes. I mean, especially compared to Jack's, and I don't mean that badly. It's right. It's far enough outside of Bar Harbor proper that if you're not looking, and back then there was no sign, right?
Right. Yeah. No, there was just
there's nothing. Yeah,
there was nothing. And I went down there, and I was like really run down and kind of tired looking, but yet at the same time had a charm about it. It was very Maine. And very, very understated. And, coming from the Jackson Lab, which was really fairly sophisticated. And it just seemed like, what is, are you really doing science here? What's happening? And it was just a different type. At the time, they were very focused on studying marine organisms. It was biomedical research. It was all in some ways very similar to what the Jackson Laboratory was doing, but done in a very different way. And so it took me a while. I had to really be convinced. It wasn't something that I was naturally like, oh yeah, this is what I want to do. I was a little skeptical, but I think, the charm of the place, the sincerity of the people working there and just, they kind of eventually wore me down. And so I when I was hired there, I was the 9th full-time employee. 3 of us were hired on the same day. So there were 6 and then there were 9. And
wow.
It was a very different place. I cried for like the first 2 weeks. Like, what have I done? Why did I do this? And when I finally realized after 2 weeks that I was like, oh, I have to take out my own trash. Okay. Like I didn't, there was no one to do anything. I mean, there, no computer support, no anything. So it was a real adjustment. I had come from from an office with about 15 people in it. And suddenly I was, an office of 1. So
did they want to bring you and, increasing their employees by 50%? Was that when the move to go to year round happened?
So it was sort of in process. The MDI Biolab had celebrated its centennial in 1998. So I came in 1999. So they were kind of gearing up. They knew that they really, where science was. So the Human Genome Project had just been completed. Science was just in just a real renaissance in some ways. And I think the leadership of the MDI Biolab really recognized that they had some unique contributions to make and that they needed to invest in more of a year-round research facility because they had been seasonal all that time.
Right. So maybe we should explain that because I know this. I don't know if I've ever told you this. My husband and I, when we got married a million years ago, honeymooned in Bar Harbor because he was a grad student at Brown. And we thought, well, we couldn't go really far. We didn't have a lot of time. And we have no idea where we're going to end up in the country. well, we may never see Acadia again. Let's just go there, right? Ironically enough. But because he was in grad school, he knew a bunch of other grad students. And one of them was working at MDI Biolab. So we actually visited her on our honeymoon and she like walked us through. She showed us the tiger shark. Like they did the whole, and I thought we were such geeks. We were all over it. We were so excited to see her. So, we'd seen her 3 days before at our wedding, but now we saw her at the lab. It was just crazy. So
that's so funny.
If you could explain kind of a little bit of what we mean by seasonal and how it started, because what you look like now is so different than what I was introduced to.
Yeah, it is. It has changed a lot. So just quickly, the history of MDIBL, and this ties, I think, very deeply to the history of Mount Desert Island. Science has always been a really big part of the history of the island in terms of, how it kind of came to be the tourist mecca that it is now. And I think because of the unique nature of the island and the diversity that was there, it's always been a place that attracted naturalists and scientists. And George Dorr, when he was formulating Acadia National Park, had a very strong vision of the island continuing to be a place that would attract scientists. And so at the time, he actively sought out a research laboratory. He wanted to establish a biological laboratory on Mount Desert Island. That was kind of part of his whole vision. And so he contacted this little group in South Harpswell, Maine. They were on a 1/4 acre in South Harpswell. They were an offshoot of Tufts College. They were a seasonal biological station where they would bring biology students from Tufts College in the summer. And he wrote to them and said, would you be willing to relocate to Mount Desert Island? I'll give you 100 acres. And they literally packed up everything and put on a barge and came north in 1921. So this is the 100th anniversary of the relocation and the establishment of the MDI Biological Laboratory. So it continued to be seasonal for the first 100 years. So when George Dorr when they had the dedication of Acadia National Park, or Lafayette National Park at the time, he said, I envision this as being a summer home for scientists. And so that's what it was for the first 100 years. It attracted scientists from all around the world would come here, largely because of the diversity of species that was easily available. There was a strong contingent of physiologists, of physician scientists who were trying to understand how our organs functioned. They were specifically looking at kidneys and trying to understand the kidney and how it worked and how they could potentially keep drugs in the body longer so that they could do their job more effectively. And so that drove a lot of the early research that was done at MDIBL, a very strong component, again, of whole organ physiology, understanding liver, kidney, all of these other things, understanding the vascular system. And that still remains a very strong component of the research that we're doing today, although now it's shifted from a physiology focus to more of a regenerative biology focus. But again, maintaining that really strong connection to place and understanding that, many of these problems that we face, there are solutions in nature. And so studying nature, looking to nature to help us answer some of these biological questions is still a really big part of what we do. So, we look at organisms in nature to understand how and why they're able to regenerate their limbs and their organs and tissues, and to see if there are lessons that we can apply to human health.
So I know that there's a couple of areas of particular focus, the kidney research and a few other things. So can you just give us a broad overview of the different, because, people may not realize this, but labs can't be everything for everyone. You actually do have to focus on something. And I don't mean people may not realize that. I think it's really easy to think, well, it's a human body, just look at it all. And that it doesn't work like that. We just can't.
Right. Well, it's super complicated. One of the challenges that we had when we transitioned from seasonal to a year-round research institution was deciding, okay, who are we recruiting? How do you know, what is our focus? And so we went through a lot of sort of, strategic planning and really thinking and looking at the history and saying, okay, where are our strengths? And so the decision was made to build on those strengths and in that sense, to one of the things that the lab has always been known for is this kind of this interdisciplinary approach to biology. And so bringing different perspectives, that's what makes it so rich. And so that we wanted to be able to capture that. And so we continue to have a very strong visiting scientist program. So, we have folks from all over that come this summer. I think we'll have in the neighborhood of 25 visiting scientists on our campus at various points. So when we went to year round, we looked at that history and said, okay, it's this strong understanding of how the body functions, this sort of comparative biology approach, looking across species to understand or to address specific questions. And so we turned to regenerative medicine, understanding repair mechanisms, and also looking at aging. So understanding that sort of nexus between regeneration and aging. I think, I'm experiencing firsthand the sort of decline in regenerative capacity that we all have as we age. And so understanding, I don't heal as quickly as I did when I was younger, or whatever that is. But that really became kind of a unifying theme of our recruiting efforts. And it was broad enough to attract a really interesting mix of scientists, but yet at the same time focused enough to, really kind of begin to develop a core intellectual, or just a rich intellectual environment at the lab. And so we don't ever expect to be overly large. We would like to sort of be in that 15 to 18 scientist range. And right now we have 10 full-time scientists. So we have some more growth, some more growing to do, but we don't ever anticipate being a really particularly large research institute. We just want to create that, you need enough kind of just people to give you that really vibrant scientific environment. So that's what we're going for.
So when you say interdisciplinary, do you mean within biology itself, or do you mean more than that?
So it's more than that. And I think part of it is we're still growing. So you have to start somewhere. So yes, within biology, I think we began there, but looking at, whether it's evolutionary biologists, molecular biologists, geneticists, whatever that is, folks who have that interest in comparative biology. That really is the founding, that core piece of what we do. And so I think as we continue to grow, we'll continue to look for a diverse group of folks to help, just to make sure that we are really bringing all of those perspectives to bear on this large biological question.
So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. How would you describe how MDI Biolab is viewed in the US versus overseas?
That's an interesting question. Within the scientific community.
That's all I'm talking about, because that's all it's not all I care about, but scientific, we'll start with science and then we can move on.
Yeah. So it's interesting, the MDI Biological Lab has a really, a surprisingly, it's surprisingly well known in that particular field. And that has to do with the tremendous history of research that's happened at MDIBL. So, in the 30s and 40s, MDIBL was really seen as kind of the mecca for kidney disease research and understanding the kidney. And so as a result, that history has really continued to follow the institution. And so it's very well known in those circles as being a place where leading scientists from, around the world would come together in the summer and again, it's that sort of bringing different perspectives. It's one of the things that I've really grown to understand about science that I don't think I ever did before, is that each scientist has their specialty. It's kind of like, I liken it to building a house. You have electricians, you have plumbers, you have architects, and that's the same in science. There are people who really just look at the equivalent of the electrical system of an organ or of an organism. And there are people who just look at the plumbing, which is kind of the kidney folks. And, so I just have a new appreciation for how scientists can come together. So you might bring, the architects, the engineers, the electricians, the plumbers, everyone together to solve a problem. And that's a lot of what we're trying to accomplish in the summers at MDIBL, is to bring in these other folks and collaborate with our scientists on a year-round basis.
If you had the opportunity to explain where MDI Biolab stands kind of in the world stature of science to someone who has a vague understanding that you're on MDI, but they don't really know what you do, how would you do it?
Well, that's a good question. I've been working on that one for a while now. But I think, one of the things people don't really recognize is how many just medical tests and treatments that we use every single day in medicine came from research that was started at MDIBL. So things like the kidney function test, right? That's a standard test that you get when you go for a physical to sort of understand how your kidneys are functioning. Dialysis, some of the leading treatments for glaucoma. A lot of that work came out of those early scientists who were at the MDI Biological Lab. So internationally, the lab in the scientific world is very highly regarded in terms of its impact on modern day medicine. We also have a tremendous impact in terms of training physicians. We do a lot of physician training. A big goal of what we do is to really help physicians understand the biology of disease. So getting away from maybe a little bit of just treating the symptoms, but more understanding the underlying mechanisms of disease and kind of how that impacts the whole. That's a big part of what we do. So I think, there's this, we operate sort of in this international realm where currently our president is from Germany. He runs one of the largest kidney research programs in Germany. So there's a very high level of recognition of what the MDI Biological Laboratory is there. And we have a lot of international conferences at the lab every year. So that's one scenario. And then we're sort of operating on Mount Desert Island where a lot of people who have lived on the island for a long time have really no idea what the MDI Biological Laboratory is or what it represents. So that's even magnified, across the state. I run into people all the time. They just have never heard of it. They don't know what we do or who we are. And then they say to me, so what do you do there? And then I say public relations, but clearly not very well.
I disagree with that, but okay. So you led me right to a question I was going to end with, but we're going to go to it now. What do you do for MDI Biolab, like development? And I know that ramping up and sustaining a large faculty of researchers. So what do you do? Like your daily / monthly work?
My daily stuff. So, I am responsible for fundraising for the organization, and that's a big responsibility. When I have worked for larger organizations, fundraising is an important part of it, but people's livelihoods don't necessarily depend on it. And I think that for me was the biggest shift in coming to the MDI Biological Laboratory. People's livelihoods depend on our success in terms of our ability to communicate why this work is important and why it should be supported. Especially, I think when you're growing, you're bringing early career scientists, students. So we've had to really, work on getting these large federal grants that are the lifeblood of any organization. And it's taken us a while to be able to do that. So fundraising has been essential in supporting the growth of the organization. It's kind of like the seed money that you need to then be able to be competitive and successful for these large federal grants. So for me, I spend a lot of my time simply communicating what our scientists are doing. And it feels like a privilege, to be able to share that with people, because it's something that not very many people know about, and they don't realize the level of science that's happening in Maine. We've made some amazing recruitments over the last 2 or 3 years. Scientists from Harvard who have come here because they really see an opportunity to build something important and new. We have this past year, we've recruited one of the leading limb regeneration scientists. He came from Europe, and then we have another regenerative medicine scientist. He's studying nerve regeneration, came from Toulouse, France. So, we're really building an international cadre of scientists and people who are leaders in this emerging field of regenerative biology to come to Mount Desert Island and help us build a very unique research program. And I think for Maine, there's just so many potential benefits for that, whether it's creating a workforce. As, one of the things I'm proudest of at MDIBL is our work to create a statewide network. It's something that we started back in 2000. It was the first grant that, the first sort of large scale grant that we ever wrote at the MDI Biolab. We had, as I mentioned, 9 full-time employees, and we had worked very hard at the state level. It was around the time of the tobacco settlement, and so there was some money to invest in research. We'd worked really hard to try and convince the legislature that this is something that Maine should invest in, in the biomedical sciences. And we were somewhat successful in that. So we got a little piece of that pie. We had about $500,000 that was awarded to MDIBL. That was huge for us at the time. It allowed us to winterize some of our first research space. And we then, submitted a federal grant for something that is now known as the IDEA Network of Biomedical Research Excellence. And that has turned, the first grant was $5 million. So for us, that was just enormous. And that allowed us to recruit our first full-time scientists to MDIBL. And that federal grant exists specifically for states like Maine, these sort of rural, underfunded states that maybe are not as competitive on the national scale in terms of amount of research grants from the National Institutes of Health. So it exists to really help these smaller institutions be more competitive. It's in, the NIH, it's in their best interest to make sure that there's a diversity in research, that rural areas are represented in sort of that national research picture. And so that grant it's now been 22 years, I guess, since we received that first grant. And that has just done a tremendous amount for supporting science around the state. There are 14 partners. And it really runs literally from Fort Kent Presque Isle to Portland, and from Farmington to Machias. All corners of the state are represented. And I think it's done a lot to really help raise the visibility of science in Maine. I was, at the University of Maine a couple of years ago when the new president gave a really nice talk on her strategic vision. And she highlighted 3 scientists that she was particularly excited about and proud of. And all 3 of those scientists came on the Embry grant. They were originally recruited and supported through that program. So, I think it is one of those quiet initiatives that is really having a tremendous impact in the state. In addition to that, it's also trained almost 3,000 undergraduate students, provided hands-on research training for those students. So it's creating a workforce that will then be available to help support growth in the science sector in Maine. So,
do you have a research project that I don't want to say your favorite, because that's not what I mean, but that just somehow delights you more than others? And maybe that's not a fair question. Like I find every single scientist I talk to at MDI Biolab, I'm in love with their project while I'm talking to them, right? Like, because I just think it's so cool. But, so it's kind of like, who was the last person I talked to? That's who I love. So,
and, for me, it's part of it is what I want to learn about, and I sort of go right now, I'm, reading The Code Breaker, which I can't get enough of that book. I mean, it's, to me, maybe it's just because this is what I've lived for the last 20 years, but to hear someone articulate the importance of curiosity-driven science is just, it's like, yes, this is what it's about, and supporting those scientists so that they have that flexibility, so that they can continue to explore these areas that we just know so little about in the bigger scheme of things. I think about scientists like Dustin Updike, who, for me, he's one of my biggest challenges in terms of explaining his work in terms that are easy to understand for a lot of non-scientists. And so because I struggle to really get my head around it, it's something that I'm constantly trying to learn more about. And he's such a great, he's just a great mentor. He really is a great teacher. And so I've really enjoyed, learning more. I sort of think of his science as kind of like blue sky science. Like he's so far out there on the leading edge of this field. It stretches my ability to sort of comprehend and understand, but it's just so fascinating when you think about what we're learning, so many things. And this, I think in the book, The Code Breakers, it's for so long when scientists didn't understand something, they just kind of set it aside. Like we don't really know what those do. And that's really part of what Dustin and his group are looking at, these organelles in these cells that we just didn't really know what their role was. And we're beginning to understand that they play just an incredibly important role in how the cell functions and how our reproductive system functions. So, it's fun for me to learn about projects like that I just know absolutely nothing about, which actually most of them I know absolutely nothing about.
So one of the things that keeps coming back to me while you're talking is the incredible importance of basic research. That, it's, I have many pet peeves about the way science is funded, and not least of which is when people take political potshots and will hold up studies and mock them. Mm-hmm. Like we spent, I don't know, I'm just making stuff up, but, $1.2 million to look at fruit flies. And someone will say, well, what's the point of that? And, mm-hmm. It's all I can do not to say, well, the point of that is, and I can't connect the dots because I don't know exactly what study they're talking about, but effectively it's like, that's one of the reasons we have the vaccines we've gotten, right? It's basic research. Absolutely. Do you find that trying to explain the value of your basic research hits roadblocks that you have to nicely grit your teeth about and then move on and really convince people why it's so important?
So it is an issue. I mean, I think it's one of those things. We're living in a unique moment in time right now, having just come through a pandemic. So this is sort of an opportunity to have that exact conversation. And not that I would wish that on anyone, but it does, it has made science and the importance of science, the importance of basic research kind of front and center in a way that it just has not been in our lifetime. And so I do think there is a tremendous opportunity to share that story. And I'm still not convinced that people really understand the role that basic research played in allowing us to have, an mRNA vaccine. And certainly that's a classic example. You're studying this in bacteriophage, right? You're studying this in worms. You're studying these things that have led now to our ability to come up with such a sophisticated mechanism of addressing a virus. It's just, and now it's in every single home. I mean, people are experiencing this in real time. And to me, that's a really exciting way to begin to talk about why basic research is so important. And I think as a fundraiser, one of the challenges is that you have to have a long-term vision, right? If you're going to be a supporter of science, you have to understand that this is not an immediate, you're not going to get something tangible necessarily immediately. It's not like, feeding the hungry or sheltering the poor, or it is a longer term vision, but the payoff is just can be so tremendous. And so that's what I like to talk with people about, is sort of why, and the fact that it is kind of for that next generation in many cases, right? It's about the future. It's about, there are certainly benefits that we all receive that are more immediate, but I do think it in some sense, it's about what's to come. And it's that discovery mentality, right? So whether it was, you were supporting space exploration, 150 years ago or whatever, but this is kind of our next thing, I think, as a society, to really, really tap into the potential benefits of science. And I think it's just incredibly exciting. It's an incredibly exciting time to be involved in science.
And I think we do have a real opportunity to explain in a creative way just how amazing this is. Not just the basic research. Some of the other kind of amazing stories is that the scale up and the engineering, and like it all weaves together to this fascinating story.
Yeah, so it really does. I think the other thing that we don't always realize is the role of science in innovation, right? So, every gadget or thing that we have. I mean, so many of them come from that kind of basic research or that curiosity driven initiative. And that's, we don't always connect those dots. We just think that, oh, okay, the iPhone, it just, it's cool and it just appeared. But I mean, somebody, doing a lot of really interesting research on that.
All right, before I let you go, I have one totally random question for you. You're going to love it. What's with the donuts?
My gosh, how did you learn about the donuts?
Do my research. I'm a well-prepared host here, Jeri.
Oh my God. Oh, that's funny. Wow, I have no idea. I just like donuts, I guess.
Good enough reason for me.
What's not to love about donuts? I don't know. It just started, my grandmother always made donuts on Sunday mornings. That was a thing. And she lived with us when I was growing up. And so we had started to go to a local restaurant called Chester Pike's, which is, in our area. And we just fell in love with it. And they had homemade donuts every Sunday and they closed and we were in withdrawal. So my husband was like, you can make some donuts. So that's how it started.
That's actually fabulous.
Then it became a recruiting tool at MDIBL. So any new scientist who was visiting, we would bring them donuts.
I got to tell you, I think it is underutilized, the way to get people through their stomach. Well, this has been a delight. I really appreciate it. Okay. I hope it was painless for you.
It was. I'm not sure there's anything useful there, but thank you.
No, there's tons useful. I think what MDI Biolab is doing is super innovative and interesting. And I think trying to tell the backstory, not the backstory. The biolab isn't just the scientists, because if it was, we wouldn't be having to worry about explaining to people all the value of it, right? So there's a whole core of support people and infrastructure people who are critical to making sure science advances. And that's one of your roles, I think, and you do it really well. So I think it's really important for people to hear the people who are the translators from the science to what it means for us, because it is unrealistic to expect that every scientist is going to be able to explain that well. Just like it would be unrealistic to expect that you and I could go in a lab and do the work because we've heard about it. I think it's really important to recognize people who are helping foster and make science more accessible, and you are definitely in that role.
Well, likewise. So
thanks. I just get to be a fangirl. My job's way easier than yours. So
I'm not sure.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast has received support from the Maine Technology Institute and is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is produced and edited by me, Kate Dickerson. I receive production support from Miranda Bouchard and social media support from Next Media. The Discover Maine theme is composed and performed by Nick Parker.